Okay, so we're going to do Old Testament overview because I feel like this will give us a foundation for the rest of the books that we may do, and especially Deuteronomy. You'll see I have a little star here because Deuteronomy becomes so important to the rest of the New Testament. And if I've heard it said, when you're reading the Old Testament, specifically the historical narratives, so Kings, Judges, all of these books, the prophets, you should be reading it through a lens of Deuteronomy, the law. So that's something that's been super helpful for me when we go into the rest of the Old Testament. But one thing to keep in mind is that the Old Testament is not a world history book. It's the history of Israel specifically. It's of God's people. So we're not going to hear about dinosaurs or things that are going on worldwide unless it pertains or is relevant to the nation of Israel, which is God's people. So this is where keeping in mind the author's intent becomes really important. The intention of the authors of the Old Testament is not to give a world history lesson. It's to give the story of how God is moving through his people, Israel. So that's kind of what this giant timeline is. It's thousands of years from creation up until we have the Roman Empire, which is the start of the New Testament. So we're just gonna jump right in. Okay, so obviously we have Genesis, creation, God creates man, and then the fall. We all know the story of Adam and Eve. So this is when sin enters the world, and a theme you will see throughout the Old Testament is the main problem with humanity is that humanity wants to determine what is right and wrong, what is good or bad for themselves. Humanity wants to be their own God. So that's started right away with the fall in Genesis. And then we have the flood and the Noahic covenant. So another thing to keep in mind throughout this entire thing is covenants are going to be crucial. It's the way that God interacts with his people. So we're going to have multiple covenants throughout. Deuteronomy itself is actually a covenant. We're going to have multiple covenants throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. And then obviously we have the New Testament where a new covenant through Jesus. But yeah, covenants are going to be how God interacts with his people throughout the entirety of history. So the first covenant, the first covenant we have, or the first promise we have, is the Noahic promise or covenant, and that's going to be the promise to never wipe out humanity again. So that would be the rainbow is the sign of the covenant, the sign of the promise. So we all know that the flood has never happened again. He's never wiped out all of human history since the time of Noah. So you have creation, the fall, the flood, then the Tower of Babel, or Babel, however you want to pronounce it. Actually, this is very interesting because the word Babel, if you just translate it, it literally is Babylon, which you'll see will become very relevant later. But right here, Babylon becomes this symbol of sin and humanity wanting to be their own God. And this is shown through the tower. Basically, all the people come together and they're like, let's build a tower to heaven, thinking that they can become God or become greater than God. And so then God disperses the people throughout the land. So that, again, it's showing that even after God tries to restart humanity's main problem of sin and wanting to be their own God remains, even after we've started it over. So then you'll have this, then we kind of zoom in. So this is kind of a little bit of world history, but then we're going to zoom in onto one family and one people group, starting with Abraham. Initially, you'll see him called Abram, and then it changes to Abraham. So don't be confused, they're the same people. But you have the Abrahamic covenant. It initially is a promise that God gives Abraham to give him land and people, or descendants and land. And this happens in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. This is key. So this is when God basically chooses the people that he's going to make into a nation, and he's going to be their God, and they will be his people. So this is the start of Israel, which you'll see later that name comes in later on. So he gives his promise to Abraham, and then Abraham has Isaac, his son, which was given to him by God. Remember, we talked about this last week where he tried to fulfill the covenant on his own with his slave girl, and you get Ishmael, but then Isaac is the son of the promise. And then you'll have, I don't know if that was me or not, but then you'll have this promise kind of reiterated to Isaac and Jacob. Abraham gave birth to Isaac, Isaac gave birth to Jacob. So this is all just gonna be like a giant family line. And then you'll see this moment in Genesis where Jacob, the son of Isaac, is going to wrestle with God. And then you see this name change. So God says, you're no longer Jacob, you're going to be called Israel. So Jacob and Israel are the same person. But from here on out, the nation is going to be identified as Israel. And that's where we get this name from. And then from here, Jacob has 12 sons. And these are going to become referenced as the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons. So it's just the 12 descendants of Jacob. Nothing super confusing. But I remember I was confused by that. It's really not that deep. It's just his 12 sons. So for the rest of this time, we're going to be going through. The 12 tribes are going to be called Israel as a whole. And then sometimes it'll be like the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Simeon. All of those, they're just the sons of Jacob. Okay, so then this is where you get the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Israel or Jacob, getting sold into slavery into Egypt, where they are slaves for 400 years. Initially they have favor, but then the Pharaoh that knew Joseph dies, a new Pharaoh comes in and enslaves all the people of Israel. And they're slaves for 400 years. And then we have what everybody knows, the Exodus. We all know about that. So God takes Israel out of Egypt and brings them into Mount Sinai, brings them to Mount Sinai, and that he does through Moses. So this is the time of Moses. So from here on out, the rest of the law, or the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Bible, 5 books of the Bible, first 5 are going to be written by Moses. That's the traditional view. But then Moses, the rest is going to be very centered around Moses until we get to Joshua. So Israel's brought out. They're in the wilderness, or they're at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and this is where you're going to get the Mosaic covenant. So this is the 10 commandments and the law. And this will be the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy are based off of this time here in the wilderness. So Moses goes up, gets the 10 commandments up to Mount Sinai, gets the tablets, whatever. And then that is the establishment of the Mosaic covenant. So then in Numbers, you'll have the wilderness wandering. So they're in the wilderness for 40 years, just kind of wandering, because remember this land that was promised all the way back here? So now, at this point, they have the people, they have descendants, because they became a great nation while they were in Egypt, but they still need the land. And so when God brings them out of Egypt, basically it's like him taking Egypt out of the Israelites and putting his way into them. So he's de-Egyptianizing the Israelites, because all they know is the way of the Egyptians. All they know is Egyptian customs. He's taking them out and he's teaching them the way in which they will be his people. So he's giving them a new law. He's giving them his way, revealing himself, his character to the people of Israel. Does that make sense? I feel like that was hard to word. Okay, so he's establishing them. He's saying, you are no longer part of Egypt. This is how my people are going to live. This is how they will function. This will be the way. This will be the law. And he establishes this covenant with them. And then, so they have the people, but they don't have the land. So this is him preparing them to go into that promised land that he promised all the way back to Abraham. But what happens is, you know the story of the spies. So they send spies into the land. They come back. They say, there's giants there. It's too big. We're not going to do it. And then only 2 spies say that they will do it. But because of this, the people don't want to go. They disobey. And so then because of that disobedience, they are sentenced to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So basically one whole generation is going to live and die in the wilderness because of their disobedience. So that's the book of Numbers. You'll see all of that kind of play out. And then, so they've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. A whole generation has passed. And now it's the second generation. And they're about to enter the promised land. And this is where the book of Deuteronomy comes in. And we'll talk about this later, but the book of Deuteronomy is kind of Moses' like farewell speech and a reminder of the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, to the people before they enter the promised land. It's like, hey guys, because the beginning of Deuteronomy, remember, is just like, he's kind of remembering everything that God brought them through. So he's like, remember what God has done for us. Here's the law again. Remember the law for when you go into the promised land. So actually, Moses never gets to go to the promised land. He dies, which is sad. Moses never gets to enter because of his disobedience, but he passes away, and then Joshua kind of becomes the head of Israel as they're beginning to conquer the land. So I want to pause right now on Deuteronomy 28. We haven't got there yet in our reading, but this becomes key to the rest of the Old Testament because at this point, Israel is kind of functioning with God on a one-to-one basis. You obey, you're blessed. You disobey, you're cursed. And so Deuteronomy 28 is the articulation of those blessings and curses. Does someone want to turn there for me? Deuteronomy 28. And then the heading, or what does the first sentence say?
And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth.
Yeah, so that's kind of the starting of the blessings. And then it'll give a list of blessings and a long list of curses. And the final curse is exile. So there'll be a bunch of curses. And then if they still don't get it, then eventually Israel will be sent into exile, basically like they have completely broken the covenant. And so when you read the blessings and curses, this becomes relevant when you're reading the prophets. So the prophets will be happening during this time, during the time that they become a kingdom. But what you'll see is that every single curse that is listed in Deuteronomy actually ends up happening once they get into this period of like obeying or disobeying the law, which ultimately will end up in them being exiled. So Israel like completely fails at obeying the covenant. But yeah, that's why we read the rest of the Old Testament through Deuteronomy 28, because then you'll kind of see, oh, Israel's disobeying right now. So obviously these bad things that are happening to them, it's not because God is unjust or mean or wrathful. It's because he's literally just functioning off this covenant that he has with them. So he's being just to the covenant. He said, hey, this will happen if you do this. And so in order for him to be just, those things end up happening. So let's just maybe pause here and review because we're about to get into kind of a new section. We have creation, the fall. We have the covenant with Abraham, the family. Then they go into Egypt where they're Exodus. God kind of takes Egypt out of them and instills his way and his covenant through the Mosaic covenant. And then they disobey with the promised land. So they wander for 40 years. And then Moses is about to die and he reiterates the covenant. He reminds them of everything God has brought them out of and into, and kind of like restates the law in Deuteronomy before he dies. So that's where we're at. And then Israel starts to conquer the land in Joshua. And then what you'll see is Israel wants basically a king, or they want a ruler. And so this gives us the book of Judges. We call it the cycle of Judges because what you'll see is that Israel will choose a judge and they'll put someone in place and they will be corrupt. They will lead the nation into sin. They'll start experiencing the covenant curses and then they'll be like, oh, this sucks. They'll cry out to God. They'll be like, God, give us a new judge. So then God will raise up a judge. It'll be a good judge. And then that judge will pass, and then Israel puts their own judge in place. And one of the main themes in Judges is all the people did what was right in their own eyes, and that was always a bad thing. Remember, coming back to the sin of man wants to do what they think is right, what they think is good. So that's kind of this cycle you see is like a man's judge rises up, God gets them out, puts in a good judge, but then Israel again brings up their own judge, and it's just this cycle. So finally, then God establishes a king over his people. First, it's Saul. Saul ended up being a bad king, and then it's David. David is where God establishes the Davidic covenant. This is very important. I think it's in 2 Samuel somewhere. But this covenant promises that Israel will have a king over them from the line of Judah for all eternity, and they will have this great nation. And so this happens here. And then David dies, and we have Solomon. Something I forgot to mention at this Mount Sinai thing, there's no established place to worship the Lord except for the tabernacle or the tent. That's going to be my picture of a tent. So basically Israel's like carrying around this tent that like houses God's presence for this entire time until finally Solomon comes into reign, David's son, and he builds the temple. So the temple for the Jews would have been symbolic of literally God's dwelling place. That is the place where they go to worship, and it symbolizes that God is with them because God's presence actually is dwelling in the temple. And so you have this establishment of the temple. When you read Samuel and Kings, you'll see there's so many chapters dedicated to what this temple looked like. It was crazy. But they spend so much time there because it would have been, this is where the Lord is dwelling. So God is with them. They have their own kingdom. Everything's going great. But then you have this little civil war between Israel, where you get the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So you have a split in the kingdom over Solomon's sons. I think it's like Jehoiakim or something. No, that's later. They're very weird names. I can't remember them. But basically these two sons, they split into the northern kingdom, which will then become Israel, and the southern kingdom, which will then become Judah. So this is the book of Kings and Chronicles. And it can be very confusing if you're reading it without knowing about this split because it will just constantly interchange throughout the entire book. And so if you're going to read that book, I always advise to like highlight Israel in one color, highlight Judah in another color, because it just helps you keep track while you're reading. Because it just interchanges so much, it's hard to understand. Okay, so Israel is ruling themselves right now. They just had a civil war, and now they're split into Israel and Judah, northern and southern. At this time, they are going to start disobeying, or they're functioning under this covenant, remember, and so they're going to be blessed or cursed based on how they're behaving, and what you'll see is Israel is very disobedient. And so you start seeing some curses happening, desolate land, stuff like that. And then this is where the prophets start. So you'll have prophets that specifically come to the northern kingdom and are sent to speak to the northern kingdom. And you'll have prophets that are specifically sent to speak to the southern kingdom. So like Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, he's a southern prophet. The book of Isaiah is a northern prophet. So when you're reading those books, it's always important to be like, is this prophet speaking to the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom? It'll help it make a lot more sense. But this is where all of your prophetic books are going to happen. And we have a few, like Daniel. Remember Daniel? Daniel happens over here. So we have a few books that occur later. But for the most part, all of the prophets are going to happen. All the books of the prophets are going to happen here. So it's like 1st, 2nd Kings, Chronicles, Samuel. All of those books and the prophets are kind of all happening at the same time. Even in our Bible, they come after each other. Okay, so the northern kingdom is going to continually disobey, and then they are going to be exiled by the nation Assyria in 722 BC. So that's the end of the northern kingdom. The tribes here are said to be never seen again, and that's pretty much the end of it. Judah is a little bit more obedient, and they last a little bit longer, like 200 some years longer. But they are continually disobedient, and then they end up being exiled by Babylon in 539 BC. I have these two dates because they have like an initial wave of exile where Babylon basically is like, okay, we'll take all of your elite people, and all of like the poor like lay people can stay as long as they like do what we say. And then Judah kind of makes them mad. They don't listen to them, and then they get like a final exile, and so everybody ends up being exiled by Babylon in 539 BC, and at this point the temple is destroyed. And so remember we talked about how the temple was symbolic of God's presence dwelling with his people. So if you are a Jew at this time, what are you thinking when the temple gets destroyed? It's like God is no longer with you anymore, right? There's no place to go and worship him. His presence is no longer in the temple. You are now in exile in Babylon. No God, your people are dispersed throughout the land. You have no identity, all this stuff. So, at this point, we have the 400 years of silence. It's not really silence, but that's what it's called. But this is going to be the break between your Old Testament and your New Testament. And between the Old Testament and your New Testament, you have 400 years, but we have no books in our Bible. It's not because nothing was happening and God wasn't moving. We just don't have any books that are deemed inspired. There are books like 1st and 2nd and 3rd Maccabees that are recording things that are happening during this time. But that's a whole nother discussion on why they're not in our Bible. They're in what's called the Apocrypha. So yeah, there's things happening here. We just don't have any record or any like books that we have in our Bible. But knowing what goes on here kind of helps us understand why we get to where we are when we get to the New Testament. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to pause here. Any questions so far?
Can you talk about, go back and say what you said about the Kings, or the Book of Kings, and where in the timeline specifically?
Yeah. So you'll have Judges, and then you'll have, I think Ruth or something. But then you have the Samuels, which is going to be Saul and David. And then you'll have Kings starting here with Solomon and ending with exile. So all of this is going to be 1st and 2nd Kings. And then also 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So Kings and Chronicles are going to be the same account of the same like history, but they're just through two different lenses. So Kings is going to be written, I think, by a prophet. So you're going to get a lot of like Elijah and Elisha because they're talking about like the prophetic things that are happening. Whereas Chronicles, I can't remember who or like what lens, but it's more about the worship and what Israel is worshiping. And so if you kind of take that lens when you're reading those two books, but they're accounting for the same like timeline. And then you also have the prophets. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions?
But it's like during the Civil War, or like
Yeah.
writing about the.
And well, the Civil War is like maybe a couple chapters because then you have all of these kings to get through and all of these kings to get through. And it'll kind of talk about like even their involvements with other nations and wars with other nations. Yeah.
Okay.
At this point, Judah is in exile in Babylon. Judah, we get the title Jews from this title. Actually, the tribe of Judah goes into exile and the people basically just start calling them the Jews. So that's where we get the term Jew. But they're in Babylon. Before they go into exile, though, you have Jeremiah had prophesied in Jeremiah 29:10 that they're about to go into exile for 70 years. But don't worry, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. That's Jeremiah 29:11. But Jeremiah 29:10 is saying, hey, you're going into exile. You'll be there for 70 years. So that's exactly what happens. They're in exile in Babylon for 70 years until Persia overthrows Babylon. So in the ancient times, ancient kingdoms, basically just what you'll see is a lot of kingdoms just overthrowing other kingdoms. That's how things functioned back then. So they're with Babylon. Babylon's strategy of exiling people was very violent. Basically, they would spread out to the people throughout the nations so that if I'm isolated from my family, if I'm isolated from my people, I no longer have my culture, my identity. They were a bit more brutal in the way they exiled. It was not a fun life to be living in exile. But then Persia will overthrow Babylon, and you'll have the king or the emperor Cyrus will be reigning, and Persia's method of how they handle their exiles is a little bit more kind, still not great, but basically they have like a theory of if we let the people worship who they want to worship, as long as they pray to their gods on our behalf, then we'll have the favor of all the gods, and then we'll prosper. So that's exactly what happens. Cyrus, we have the Cyrus decree in 539 BC. You have the Cyrus decree, which happens, and the Persian king Cyrus basically allows Israel to go back to their land and to rebuild their temple. Because he says, hey, go back to your land, rebuild your temple, and if you do this, pray to your God that your God will give me favor. So, after this decree, you'll see that Israel goes back, some of them start going back to the land, and this is where you get the books of like Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai. It's called the Minor Prophets. They're going to be about this time. I'll write that up here. Where they're going back into the land and starting to rebuild the temple. But what you'll see is that the second temple is not as great as Solomon's first one, and the Lord's presence actually never ends up coming back to fill the temple. So they're kind of at this like, oh, this kind of like anticlimactic. They thought they were going to go back. They thought everything was going to be good. And then it just kind of like flatlines. So at this point, they're under the reign of Persia. And then you have Greece. Greece overthrows Persia with the ruler Alexander the Great. We've all heard of him. So Alexander the Great conquers an insane amount of land in just 13 years, one of that being the land of Persia, Persia's empire. So he's doing all this conquering, and you see this little squiggly line I drew all the way throughout here, and I said squiggly line equals Hellenization. So let's talk about Hellenization for a minute. Alexander the Great's theory on uniting his kingdom or becoming powerful was to basically Greekanize everyone, basically make everybody culturally Greek. And that also meant the language. So then everybody was required to speak Greek. So this Greekanizing is called Hellenization. And that was his method of kind of uniting the kingdom. And that is why actually the New Testament is written in Greek, is all because of Alexander the Great and his theories on how to rule and establish power throughout such a large kingdom. This kind of sets the stage for the gospel as well to progress, because that allows there to be a unified language which the gospel can spread throughout a nation with. And then you'll see later with the Romans, they'll build the Roman roads, which help the gospel also progress, as there's roads to get like throughout the nation safely. So you have Hellenization, you have Jews in Israel becoming culturally Greek, both in language and how they live. That also means their religion, which gods they're going to worship. So you're going to have a lot of the Greek gods become relevant at this point. Okay, so Alexander the Great is conquering all these nations, one of them being Persia. He does it in 13 years, but then he suddenly dies. And at this point, he didn't have like a successor that was going to come after him, like lined up to come after him. So they're kind of in this like, oh my gosh, what do we do? And he had 4 generals. And so they were like, let's just split the kingdom up into like between his 4 generals. The 2 that become most relevant to us are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. This is the northern and southern of the like northern or of the kingdom split. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of this 4-way split basically are going to be kind of like at war with each other throughout. And Israel is going to be right kind of on that line of what they're fighting over. So Israel, they're living through all this like power change, and they're just like sick of people kind of just coming and taking them back and forth. But eventually you have, I think it was one of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus Epiphanes. And what he's going to do is he is going to go into the temple, and he is going to perform what becomes known as the abomination of desolation. So he goes into the temple and he slaughters a pig on the altar. And as we know from Deuteronomy, or when you read Deuteronomy, you'll see that a pig is deemed unclean. So this is like basically just spitting in the face of the Jews. You're taking an unclean thing, bringing it into the temple, slaughtering it on the altar where God's like holy presence is supposed to be dwelling, and yeah, abomination of desolation. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, are we still in this 400 years of silence?
Yes. So from here to we'll just say this is like New Testament time. From here to the New Testament. So all of this is what's happening between Malachi and Matthew. And you'll see about right here is where we get the first, second, and third, like Maccabees, which is one of the 3 books in the Apocrypha. They're historical narratives. And it's very similar. I've never read them, but it's kind of similar to Kings and Chronicles, where you're just getting like the story of what happened in the history. Okay, so you have the Alexander the Great splits into 4 kingdoms, 4 generals. The north and the southern generals always fighting. Then the Seleucids come in and they commit the abomination of desolation in the temple of Israel. At this point, the Israelites are fed up. And so what you have is the Judas Maccabeus is a Jewish or an Israelite person. And he basically rises up and they have this revolt against these Seleucids and they end up overthrowing them, which is crazy. And this is where we get to the celebration of Hanukkah, is to celebrate Judas Maccabeus. And then you have right here the start of the Hasmonean dynasty. It's called Hasmonean because Judas Maccabeus wasn't his real name. It was, he was from like the Hasmonean family. So basically his family starts to rule and they rule for 100 years. So if you're Israel and you have this promise, this Davidic promise of a kingdom that you will rule yourselves, maybe you're thinking, oh, finally, we've overthrown this power and now we're ruling ourselves. But if you read what this kingdom will be like, it's prosperous. God's presence is there. This would be very like, is this really it? God hasn't filled the temple. It's not that great. There's lots of tensions and things, and you'll see they end up actually being overthrown later. So yeah, they have 100 years where they're ruling themselves, but it's just kind of like meh. And Judas Maccabeus, Book of Maccabees, first, second, third, the correlation. So that, if that helps you remember what that history is covering, it's covering this history. Okay, so then you have the Hasmonean dynasty. Basically, there's like a dispute over like one of the overturnings of power between some brothers. They can't figure out who's going to be king. And so they go to the Roman emperor or leader at the time, Pompey, because Pompey was known to kind of help people out in this way. So Pompey comes and he's gonna kind of help figure out this dispute and then realizes it's way more complicated than he was told it was, and he's just like, fine, I'm just gonna overthrow them. So at that point, then Israelites come under the kingdom of Rome, and from that time out until New Testament time, they are under the Roman Empire. And that is when Jesus comes on the scene, everything's Roman, but then culturally also everything's Greek because of the Hellenization. So you have Greco-Roman culture, and we'll talk about that a lot in the New Testament.